and welcome to Jolene Knits a Lot. This is my channel about all the knitting that I get up to. Lately I've been really interested in making sock tubes with my 3D printed sock machines. I have a video on how to build your own 3D printed circular sock machine. I also have a video on how to crank a simple tube with that machine. And today I'd like to show you how to turn that simple sock tube into a pair of socks. I have some yarn that I'm going to be knitting my heels, cuffs, and toes in. I have one sock tube that we'll be looking at in a bit. I also have a long circular needle that you can use for magic loop, or if you prefer, you can knit, use this long circular needle to pick up stitches and then switch to DPNs, which is what I'm going to be doing. Let's have a look at this sock tube. This is one long tube that I have cranked with my 64 stitch sock machine. I chose to knit this tube in one piece, so I'm going to cut this in half to make two socks out of one long tube. When you're knitting with a circular sock machine, you usually use some waste yarn to cast on your stitches, and you can see here that I have some bright orange waste yarn that I'm going to need to remove before I can knit my toes or cuffs, and so I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to use my long circular needle, and in this case I'm using a 2.25 millimeter needle, but your results may vary. I find it's best just to start with a sock needle that you're used to knitting with, and we're going to use it to pick up stitches along that waste yarn. So I'm going to find where, it's pretty obvious on this one, where the two yarns meet. Now you can see on the inside of my tube, I've got my tail of my good yarn right here and my tail of my waste yarn right here. When I look at it from the opposite side or from the right side, you can see that this is the first or last stitch knit with the main color yarn before switching to my waste yarn. So I'm going to start there, and I'm just going to pick up the right leg of half the stitches, and in this case that'll be 32 stitches. So as you can see, I've picked up the right leg of the first two stitches. I've got 3, 4, 5, 6, and I'm just going to keep going until I have 32 stitches on my needle. All right, that's 32. I'm going to pull my needle through so that my stitches are on the cord of my needle. I'm going to flip it over and pick up the next 32 on the other side. Okay, I've got all my stitches picked up and ready to go. I'm just going to center them on the cords. And for those of you who are used to using magic loop, you'll see that now you're ready to knit magic loop when we start knitting the toe. Now I'm going to remove this waste yarn. As you can see, I had cut through and I've got little tail ends here, but I'm just going to pull it out, and it should just unravel as I go around. Okay, as I'm pulling out the last few stitches of my waste yarn, you can see that my stitches from my sock tube are sitting nicely on my needle. And I can just pull out the remaining waste yarn, and I'm left with live stitches ready to knit. Now I'm just going to knit a simple wedge toe. But at this point you could knit whatever toe you like. There are many different types of sock toes, and everybody seems to have a favorite. I'll be knitting a wedge toe, and I'll show you how to do that. I'm going to pick up my contrast color for my heels, cuffs, and toes. In this instance, I'm using just a simple gray color, and I'm going to start knitting. I'm going to knit the first round plain, and as you can see, I'm going to switch to DPNs because that's my preferred method, but you can use whatever method of knitting socks in the round that you like. So I'm just going to go ahead and knit the first row. Or the first round, sorry. I've knit one round with my contrast color, and I've switched to some DPNs. I'm going to start the decreases from my wedge toe now. And wedge toes are knit in a similar way for no matter how many stitches you have on your needle. So you divide the number of stitches you have in half. I have 32 stitches on this front needle, and I have 16 stitches on each of these two back needles for another 32. So in order to knit a wedge toe, you simply knit one stitch, and now we're going to do a decrease. So we're going to do a left leaning decrease. So we'll slip, slip, knit, and then we'll knit until we're 3 stitches before the halfway point. There we are, 3 stitches left. And now I'm going to do a right leaning decrease. So I'm going to knit 2 together and then knit 1. I'm going to turn my work, and I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other side of my tube. So I'm going to knit 1 stitch. I'm going to do a left leaning decrease, so slip, slip, knit. And then I will knit until I'm 3 stitches before the end of my tube. There I am, 3 stitches left. And now I'm going to do a right leaning decrease, knit 2 together, and knit 1 stitch. So that's the decrease round of a wedge toe. And now we're going to knit 1 round plain with no decreases. I'm going to keep doing those 2 rounds, 1 decrease round, 1 plain round, until I have a total of 24 stitches left. I'll have 12 stitches on my front needle, and I'll have 12 stitches divided on my 2 back needles, so 6 here and 6 here. And then we'll be ready to do a Kitchener stitch to close up the toe. So I'm going to knit my wedge toe, and I'll meet you back here when I have 24 stitches left. All right, I've cut myself a fairly long tail of yarn and put that tail on a tapestry needle. And I'm going to start with the stitches in the front. From this perspective, these stitches look like knit stitches, and if I sort of open it up, the stitches on the back needle from this angle look like purl stitches. So we'll just keep that in mind for while we work the Kitchener stitch. The first stitch on my front needle, I am going to enter purlwise, so from right to left, and purl the yarn through and leave it on the needle. Then I'm going to go to the first stitch on my back needle and enter it knitwise, so from left to right. And I'm going to pull it off, or pull the yarn through and leave it on the needle. That was just sort of a little setup around. Make sure that the yarn goes in between your needles and not around them. There we go. Okay. So that was my setup, and now I'm going to do the Kitchener stitch. So I'm going to go into the first stitch on my front needle, knitwise, and pull it off. So that means from left to right, and pull it off. And I will go into the next stitch on my front needle purlwise, so from right to left, and leave it on. Now I'll go into the front stitch on my back needle, purlwise, and take it off, and then go through the next stitch knitwise and leave it on. And I'm just going to keep doing those sort of 4 moves across all of the stitches until they've all been worked. So again, to the front needle, I'm going to go knitwise off, purlwise on. Now I'll go to my back needle, purlwise off, and then the next stitch is knitwise, and it stays on. All right, back to the front needle, knitwise, off, tube, purlwise, on, back needle, purlwise, off, knitwise, on. Okay, I've gone through all of my stitches working the Kitchener stitch, and I'm left with one stitch on my front needle and one stitch on my back needle. I'm going to go through the stitch on my front needle knitwise and pull it off. Now I will go through the stitch on my back needle purlwise and pull it off. And there we go. We have done the Kitchener stitch. Hopefully yours looks a little bit like mine, and the seam that we've created looks like the other rows of knitting above and below it. Now I'm just going to take this tail and I'm going to poke it into my sock, and I'm going to weave it in. I'm also going to weave in the ends from the start of my tube, which happen to be over here. You can see they're a little loose right there. So I'm just going to take a moment to go ahead and weave in my ends before we start the next portion of our sock tube socks. Now that we've finished our toe, it's time to get ready to do the ribbing. If you have cranked out 2 sock-sized tubes, so 1 tube for each sock, you can go ahead and pick up the waste yarn at the other end of your sock and get ready to do the ribbing. I've cranked out 1 long tube, and I've marked 1 stripe in the middle that I'll be sacrificing to make 2 same-sized socks. What I'm going to do is use 2 circular needles to pick up the stitches along this stripe. I'll be picking them up along this pale pink section here, and I will also be picking them up along this peach section here. Again, I'll do 32 and then another 32 so that I'm ready to do some magic looping if that's how I like to knit. All right, I have picked up along one color side, and now I'm going to go and pick up with another needle the other side. When you're picking up these stitches, make sure that you are picking up the stitches in one round. So not moving up or down a stitch, but moving from stitch to stitch sideways in the same round. Okay, I have 2 sets of stitches on needles secured. So if I could cut this center section, none of those stitches are going to unravel or fall apart. I'm going to take out my stitch marker here, and I'm going to snip a stitch just in the middle. And I'm going to work my way around with a tapestry needle or a knitting needle and just pull out that row of knitting that I've just snipped. Knitting doesn't like to unravel sideways. It likes to unravel up and down. And so when you're pulling out a round of stitches like this, you do need to sort of help it along with a needle of some kind. I'm going to keep pulling away at this stitch until I'm about halfway around, and then I'm going to start at this end and move around in the opposite direction until I have 2 separate tubes. And there we have it, 2 separate tubes. I'm going to be working on this one because it's the one with the toe. And then I can just leave these stitches on this needle to be worked after I've completed this one. So I'll set this one aside and we'll keep working on this sock. I'm just going to pull back the rest of this stripe that we're not going to be keeping. And just like it was the waist yarn from the beginning of the sock, I'll just pull it back and there we have it. I'm going to trim this yarn so that it doesn't get in our way. And I'll begin to knit some ribbing. Again, I'm going to switch to DPNs because that's my preferred method, but you can do whatever method you like to knit small circumference knitting. I'm just going to pick up my contrast yarn or my heels, cuffs and toes yarn, and I'm going to knit 1 round plain. The reason I'm knitting 1 round plain is that when you purl stitches, you get a bit of a blip of the color from the row below being pulled up into your purl stitch. And so to make my ribbing all one cohesive color, I'm just going to knit 1 round before I start ribbing. All right, I have knit 1 round and now I'm going to start my ribbing. I like to do 2 by 2 ribbing, but you can do whatever ribbing suits you best. I'm going to knit about 10 rounds of 2 by 2 rib. And then once I've completed that, I'll show you how to do a stretchy bind off for the top of your sock tube socks. I'm done my 10 rows of ribbing, and now I'm going to do a stretchy bind off so that these socks will fit over my feet. I'm going to do Jenny's Surprisingly Stretchy Bind Off. This is something that you may be familiar with. There are many tutorials for this technique. I'm going to start at the beginning of this needle, and I will start with a yarn over my needle, and then I will knit the first stitch. And I'll pull that yarn over the stitch. This gives, the yarn overs give each of these bind off stitches a little bit more ease and flexibility. Now I'm going to do a yarn over from the back over the top of the needle to the front, and then I'm going to knit a stitch and pull both the yarn over and the previous stitch up and over. When I approach a purl stitch, I'm going to do a yarn over, but I'm going to do it from the back to the front and over. I'll purl a stitch and then pull the yarn over and the previous stitch up and over. And the next stitch is a purl stitch, so I'll do it again. From the front to the back and around, I'll do a purl stitch, and then I'm going to pull those 2 stitches up and over. I'm going to keep continuing that technique all the way around. So in my next stitch is a knit stitch. I'll start in the back and go over the top of the stitch. I'll knit a stitch and then lift those 2 loops over. Again, the next one is a knit stitch, so I'll go over the top of my needle. I'll make a knit stitch and then I'll pull those 2 loops over. Now I've got a purl stitch, so I'll come underneath and around. I'll purl a stitch and pull 2 loops over, and again I'll come around, make a purl stitch, and then purl my 2 loops over. And I'm going to use that same technique all the way around until I have 1 stitch left. I'll see you then. I have 1 stitch left on my needle, and I'm going to sew that with my tapestry needle and the end of the yarn. I'm just going to remove this needle, and I'll use my tapestry needle to pull the yarn through that loop. Now I'm going to go under one of the V's at the very beginning of the bind off under both legs of that V and back down through the loop of that stitch. Now that little loop that we created creates a V that looks a lot like the other stitches and hides where we began and ended. Now I'm just going to weave this tail in to the inside of my sock, and I'll be ready to insert an afterthought heel. Okay, my sock now has a toe and a cuff, and I'm ready to insert my afterthought heel. In order to know where to insert your afterthought heel, you should know approximately how long your foot is. My foot is 9 inches, so we'll use that sort of as an example. When we knit an afterthought heel, it is essentially the same as your toe, but placed where your heel goes. So let's measure our toe that we've knit to see how deep the heel will be. So if I measure this toe that I have knit with my yarn and my gauge, I get about 1.75 inches. And I know that my foot is 9 inches long. So I'm going to subtract 1.75 from 9 inches, and I get 7 1/4. And that is where I'm going to put my heel. Because when I add my heel, I will get another 1.75 inches, just like my toe. So that means my heel is going to go right sort of in the middle of this light pink stripe. It doesn't have to be exact. I'm not of the school where everything needs to be counted and perfect. I think that knitting stretches and gives and is forgiving in that way. So let's measure to 7.25, which is right about here, and that's where I'm going to put a stitch marker so I know where to insert my heel. Just go in the middle of this stripe. Okay. So when I add my 1.75 inches of knitting here, this will then measure 9 inches, and it will be about the same size as my foot. If you like your socks more snug, you may opt to make this distance a little shorter so that there is a bit more negative ease there and your sock fits a bit more snug. That is personal preference, and the best way to find that out is to knit a few pairs of socks and see which ones you like to wear the most. Okay, we have a placement for our sock, and now we need to pick our heel, and now we need to pick up some stitches. So what I'm going to do is go down with my long circular needle. I'm going to go down the side of the sock. I like to start with the toe flat, and I'll just kind of zip down to figure out where to start. And I'm going to pick up, again, half the number of stitches for my sock, plus 2 extra on either side. Those extra stitches are going to help me close up any gaps that might happen when I knit my toe. So I'm going to pick up 32 plus 2. I'm going to pick up 34 stitches. And I'm just going to start on this side edge. And again, making sure that you pick up stitches in a horizontal row to make sure that you're not going up or down a row. And I'm just going to go ahead and pick up 34 stitches. Okay. I've got my first set of stitches picked up. Now what I'm going to do is remove my stitch marker. And I'm going to leave one row of knitted fabric, and I'm going to drop down to the row of knitting below that. I'm going to start on the side where I started picking up, and I'm going to pick up another 34 stitches for the other side of the heel. So I'm going to start just below the first stitch that I picked up. I'm going to skip one stitch here, and I'm going to start on the next row down, and I'm going to pick up another 34 stitches. Okay, I've got 2 sets of 34 stitches on my needles. I like to slide them so that the stitches are on the cables, because the cables are flexible and they're also slightly more narrow than the needle tips themselves, so it gives me a little bit more wiggle room. I'm now going to snip one stitch in the middle of that row of knitting in between my needles. Now, all of these stitches are safely on needles and they won't unravel. Being careful to only snip the yarn that is running in between the needles. I'm going to take one leg of that row in between them and I'll snip it. All right. Now I'm ready to remove this yarn from in between my two needles, and I'm just going to slowly pick it out, working from the inside to the outside of where we're going to insert our heel. I'm not going to remove all of the stitches. I'm going to leave a couple at the end still in place. This is also going to help you to not get any holes forming at the corners of your heel. Okay, I've got 2 stitches left there on my needles, as you can see in between. And now I'm going to go to the other side, and I'm going to do the same thing. These tails of yarn from the snipped yarn are going to sit inside your sock tube, and at the very end you can use that yarn to neaten up any holes that may have occurred, and then just weave them in. Okay, and again on this side, I'm going to leave a couple of stitches still on, still remaining, so that these will help close up any gaps that may form as we knit our heel. And I'm going to tuck my tail to the inside. I'm ready to start my heel. And I have a high instep, which means that the distance between the bottom of my heel to the top of my foot is quite high. If you have a high instep, or the person you're knitting these socks has a high instep, you may choose to knit a few extra rounds here to give your heel some extra depth. I like to knit 3 rounds for myself. And again, this is trial and error, and you will find as you knit more and more pairs of socks this way, which measurement works best for you. So I'm going to knit 3 plain rounds before I start any decreases. On the first round, I'm going to have to decrease those extra stitches that I picked up. So I'm going to get my needles ready to go. I'll get my yarn ready. And the first 2 stitches that I have here on my needle, I'm going to do and knit 2 together. And I will have decreased 1 stitch. Now I'm going to knit to the end of my top needle until I have 2 stitches left. I have 2 stitches left on my front needle, and I'm going to do an SSK and decrease 1 stitch. So now on this front needle, I have decreased those 2 extra stitches that I initially picked up. I'm going to do the exact same thing on my back needle. So I'm going to knit 2 together, the first 2 stitches. And I'm going to knit to the last 2 stitches on my back needle. I now have 2 stitches left, and I'm going to do an SSK to decrease those stitches away. Now I have my original number of stitches again. If you may remember, this was originally a 64 stitch sock tube, and I'm back to 64 stitches to work my heel on. So that was 1 round of knitting. It did have some decreases, but now I'm going to work 2 more rounds even. Again, this is just to give my heel a little extra depth. If you do not need extra depth in your heel, you can omit these original or these initial plain stockinette rounds, or you can knit more stockinette rounds if you find that you have a higher instep and that is your preference. So now I'm just going to knit 2 more rounds in plain stockinette. Okay, I have knit my 3 rounds of plain stockinette knitting and I'm ready to start my heel. The good thing is that you've already done this before, because we're going to knit exactly the same decrease pattern that we did for our toe at the heel. So we're going to knit 1 stitch. We're going to do a left leaning decrease. So I'm going to do an S, S, K. Then I'll knit to the last 3 stitches on the front needle. So there we have 3 stitches. I'm going to do a right leaning decrease. So I'm going to knit 2 together. And then I'm going to knit 1 stitch. And I'm going to do that same thing on the back needles. So I'll knit 1. I'll do a left leaning decrease, SSK. And then knit to the last 3 stitches the back half of the sock. Because I'm working on DPNs, I have the back stitches divided in 2. So that's the halfway point for my back stitches. And I'm going to keep knitting till I get to the last 3 stitches. Whoops. And there I have my last 3 stitches. I'm going to do a right leaning decrease, which is a knit 2 together and knit 1. Now I'll knit 1 round plain, and I'll keep alternating the decrease rounds with a plain round of knitting until I have my desired number of stitches. For the toe, I decreased to 12 stitches. For the heel, I often give myself a couple of extra stitches. It depends on what kind shape of heel you have. If you have a more narrow heel, you may choose to decrease down to 12 or 10. If you have a wider heel, you may only decrease to 14 or 16. Again, that will be trial and error to figure out what works best for you. I will be decreasing to 14 stitches, and then I'll do the Kitchener stitch, which I showed you previously, to close it all up. And I'll show you what this sock looks like when I'm all done. I finished Kitchenering up my heel, and as you can see, it looks a lot like the toe did. So now it's time to weave in some ends. I'll take this yarn and just tuck it into the sock and pull it through to the back. And I'll just use a duplicate stitch to weave in my ends. So here at the toe, I'll just follow a row of knitting up and down, following the yarn as it goes in its path. I find duplicate stitch to be nice and stretchy and doesn't add too much bulk. So that's one end woven in. So that's one end woven in, and I'll snip it, leaving a bit of an end. So I'm not going to cut it right close to the fabric, but I'll leave a little bit of yarn so that the yarn tail does not get pulled through as the fabric stretches. Now we'll just work in my other yarn tails. Here's one on this side. This was one of those tails that we pulled when we snipped our yarn to make the afterthought heel. Again, I'm just going to duplicate stitch through a line of knitting in the same color if I can. This provides some strength to where the corners of the heels are, and also allows us to work the tail in. This tail can be used to close up any holes that might have occurred in the corners of your socks. There we go. And again, I'm going to cut it, leaving a bit of yarn exposed, and I'm not going to cut it right next to the knitted fabric. I'll do that again with these two tails. One of them is the yarn tail from my contrast color, and the other is the tail that we pulled out when we were knitting or cutting in our afterthought heel. If you're wondering which direction to sew your end in, I find it helpful to simply kind of tug on your yarn in one direction and then tug it in the other direction and see which way the yarn wants to go. In this case, the yarn wants to be worked in this direction. And if you can't tell, then do whichever one you think looks best. And there we have it. One sock tube turned into a sock. I've knit the toe, a cuff, and an afterthought heel. I've woven in my ends, and all that's left to do is make the pair. I hope you've enjoyed this video on how to turn one sock tube into a pair of socks. I hope you enjoyed turning sock tubes into socks for your friends and your family. Please like and subscribe this video for more knitting content from Jolene Knits A Lot. Thanks so much for joining me. I'll see you soon.